Just want to do a real quick video on solving quadratic equations by completing the square. This is not really covering the concept behind it, but just a quick how-to. First thing I do is I move the constant to the other side. So I'm going to write this as x squared plus 8x plus, I'm leaving a blank to complete the square, negative 15 plus blank. So I just subtracted 15 to both sides. Then we're going to take the middle term. We are going to complete the square here. We need to turn this into a perfect square trinomial. Take the 8. You want to do half of that is 4. And we're going to square that. We get 16. Whatever you add to one side, you have to do to the other. So now we have this. We have completed the square. So we can write it in this format. Negative 15 plus 16 is 1. And now I'm going to do the square root property, which is just to square root both sides. Don't forget it's plus or minus. The square root of 1 is just 1, so we get x plus 4. Let's get rid of that parenthesis here. X plus 4 equals plus or minus 1. So we have x plus 4 equals 1, or x plus 4 equals negative 1. So we get x equals negative 3, x equals negative 5. And those are our solutions. Next problem, set it up the same way. So we're going to have x squared minus 6x plus, I'm leaving a blank to complete the square, negative 2, because I subtracted the 2 from both sides, plus blank, because you have to do the same thing to both sides. Half of negative 6 is negative 3. You square that, you get 9. So that's what it takes to complete the square. So I have a 9 here. Now I can write it in this factored format. X minus 3 quantity squared equals 7. I'm ready to square root both sides. Don't forget plus or minus. So we have x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. We can't simplify that, and actually that even as a radical you can't simplify it. So then you're going to add 3 to both sides. We get 3 plus or minus the square root of 7. It's fine to leave your answer like that, or you could write 3 plus the square root of 7. X equals 3 minus the square root of 7. These are exact values. That is preferable to leave your answer in that format. Next one, we're going to start by moving the constant to the other side, set it up to complete the square. So we have negative 3 plus blank. I'm going to take half of this. Now notice half of 5 is not an even number, so I'm taking half of 5 and I'm squaring it. So I square the top, square the bottom. I find it preferable to leave it as a fraction. So I get 25/4. So now here I'm going to have x plus 5/2, quantity squared. And here we're going to need to find a common denominator. So it would be 4. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by 4. I get negative 12/4 plus 25/4, which is 13/4. So now I have 13/4 here. Okay, if you need to use your calculator, fine. So now I'm going to square root both sides. So I get x plus 5/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 13/4. Now you can take the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. So it would be better to write this as x plus 5/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 13. Now the square root of 4 is just 2, so I'm going to write that way. So now I'm going to subtract the 5/2 from both sides. I prefer to put it in the front, so I get negative 5/2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. Now because I have a common denominator, I can actually write this as negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 13 all over 2. I would probably write the answer like that. The one I have preceding is okay. Next problem. So I'm going to start off the same way. X squared plus 4x plus blank equals negative 12 plus blank. Half of 4 is 2. Square it, you get 4. Do the same thing to both sides. So here I have x plus 2 quantity squared. If you're wondering how I know it's a 2, it was whatever half of this was. So negative 12 plus 4 is negative 8. Square root both sides. Don't forget plus or minus. So we get x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 8. Well, remember when we have the square root of a negative, I'm going to come over here to the side. We know this is going to be I root 8. because the square root of -1 is equal to I. And then I can break this down. Think of it as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. So I get 2 root 2, but I had an I there. So we have x plus 2 equals plus or minus 2I root 2. And now I'm going to subtract the 2. I'm going to put it in the front. I get -2 plus or minus 2I root 2, which tells me that I have a complex numbers for my solution. If I graphed the related parabola, y equals this, it would not have any x-intercepts. It would not cross the x-axis. Next problem. Notice the difference here. Every other problem I've done was just an x squared. Now I have a coefficient other than 1 in front of the x squared. That changes things. The first thing we're going to do is we have to divide everything by 2. So divide both sides by 2. Okay, I looked up here and I thought that I hadn't hit record again and that, that it was not recording. Divide both sides by 2. So we're going to do that. I'm going to divide everything by 2. So I get x squared plus 4x minus 3/2 equals 0 divided by 2 is still 0. Now I can do like I did before. Now I got a fraction in there, not a big deal. So we get x squared plus 4x plus blank equals 3/2 plus blank. Half of 4 is 2. Square it, you get 4. So we have x plus 2 quantity squared. I'm going to find a common denominator here. So when I do that, I get 3/2 plus 8/2. So we get 11/2. Okay, I didn't make this one very nice. So we're going to have, when we square root both sides, we're going to have x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 11/2. And we're going to write that as -2 plus or minus the square root of 11/2. Now, neither one of those are perfect squares. And I'll just tell you right now, normally you don't leave a square root in the denominator of a fraction, but we haven't got to the part where we've simplified those in that way. So we're going to leave it like that. Yeah, it's okay. So that would be what you do. But so the difference on these is you do have to divide everything by whatever the coefficient to the x squared is. You have to do that first before you can go through the completing the square process. Now remember, completing the square is just one of our 5 methods. We haven't done the 5th one yet, to solve quadratic equations. And this primarily is probably not going to be your top choice, especially if you have a coefficient in front of the x squared, because it creates some really messy fractions. So you know that it's important to learn when to use what method, when is it appropriate. So hopefully this helps.